Officer Vance Harlan never imagined his 15-year reign of terror would end sprawled face down on a courtroom floor. Vaulting over the defense table with a feral roar, the corrupt cop locked his furious eyes on the Honorable Judge Loretta Graves. He fully expected the judge to scream and cower behind her polished mahogany bench, yielding to the bigoted power dynamic he had worshipped his entire life. Instead, Judge Graves did not even flinch, rising smoothly to her feet with the lethal, calculating grace of a former military police captain. Her eyes turned ice cold. In the next agonizing second, Harlan's violent, arrogant world was about to permanently shatter. The air inside courtroom 302 of the 12th District Superior Court was thick with the kind of manufactured silence that only precedes a storm. It was an overcast and gray morning, casting long, muted shadows across the polished, hardwood floors and the rows of heavy wooden pews. At the defense table sat Officer Vance Harlan. He wore a sharply tailored navy blue suit that barely concealed the bulky, aggressive musculature of his shoulders. His jaw was set in a rigid line of defiance, and a faint, sneering smile played at the corners of his mouth. Harlan was not a man accustomed to the defendant's seat. For 15 years, he had been the one putting people in cages. He stalked the streets of the city's south side with a predatory entitlement, fully convinced that the badge pinned to his chest elevated him above the laws he was sworn to enforce. He had a reputation in the precinct, a cowboy to his admirers, a dangerous liability to anyone paying close attention. His file was a thick litany of excessive force complaints, almost entirely filed by young black men. Yet thanks to a deeply entrenched network of police union lawyers and a code of silence among his peers, Harlan had always walked away. Today, however, was supposed to be different. Harlan was facing 2 counts of aggravated assault under color of authority, alongside felony evidence tampering. The victim was a 22-year-old college student named Quentin Hale, whose only crime had been driving a slightly battered sedan with a busted tail light in a neighborhood Harlan considered his. The resulting traffic stop had ended with Quentin in an intensive care unit with a fractured orbital bone and a shattered collarbone. Beside Harlan sat his attorney, Harlan Voss, a high-priced defense lawyer known for his aggressive, borderline abusive cross-examinations. Voss was busy shuffling through a stack of manila folders, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Relax, Vance," Voss murmured, not looking up from his notes. "We've seated a favorable jury. Half of them have law enforcement ties. We just need to play the narrative. A high-stress situation, a non-compliant suspect, a split-second decision made to ensure officer safety." Harlan scoffed, adjusting his cuffs. "I'm not worried, Harlan. The system knows how this works. I'm the one holding the line. They aren't going to throw me to the wolves over some street punk who didn't know his place." The racial undertone in his voice was not subtle. It never was. It was a casual, ingrained arrogance that had festered unchallenged for decades. "All rise." The deep, resonant voice of the bailiff, Marcus Telford, boomed through the courtroom. "The Superior Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Loretta Graves presiding." The side door swung open, and Judge Loretta Graves stepped into the courtroom. The atmosphere instantly shifted, tightening like a tuned piano wire. Judge Graves was a woman of formidable presence. In her late 50s, a black woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back into a severe, immaculate bun. She wore the black robe not just as a uniform, but as armor. She was known throughout the state as a brilliant legal mind with zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. Before earning her law degree at Georgetown, she had served a decade in the Army Military Police Corps, retiring as a captain. She possessed a quiet, devastating intensity that made even the most seasoned attorneys sweat through their tailored shirts. Harlan stared at her as she took her seat at the elevated bench. His sneer deepened. In his narrow, prejudiced worldview, Loretta Graves was an anomaly he refused to respect. He had spent his entire career exerting violent authority over black citizens. The sight of a black woman sitting in absolute judgment over his fate was a psychological splinter he couldn't ignore. He leaned back in his chair, deliberately crossing his arms in a display of dismissive body language. Judge Graves arranged her files with precise, methodical movements. She did not immediately look at the defense table. She let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, establishing absolute control over the room. "Be seated," she finally commanded. Her voice was smooth, measured, and completely devoid of warmth. She looked directly at Harlan. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Harlan tried to project dominance, a hard, unyielding stare meant to intimidate. Judge Graves's expression did not change, but her eyes registered his arrogance and categorized it immediately. She had seen men like Vance Harlan 1,000 times before, men who confused brutality with strength and bigotry with order. "We are here for the matter of the state versus Vance Harlan," Judge Graves announced, looking toward the prosecution table. Assistant District Attorney Nolan Pendleton, a sharp, meticulous lawyer with a reputation for playing strictly by the book, stood up. "The state is ready, Your Honor," Pendleton said. "Defense?" Graves asked, shifting her gaze to Voss. "Ready, Your Honor," Voss replied smoothly, standing. "Very well," Judge Graves said, folding her hands together. "Before we bring in the jury, Mr. Voss, I want to be entirely clear about the boundaries of this trial. I have reviewed your preliminary witness list and your motion to introduce the victim's juvenile disciplinary records from middle school." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "That motion is denied. We are trying Officer Harlan's actions on the night of the incident, not Mr. Hale's behavior when he was 13 years old." Voss bristled. "Your Honor, the defense believes establishing a pattern of anti-authoritarian behavior is crucial to understanding the threat my client perceived." "Mr. Voss?" Graves interrupted, her voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. "A detention slip for talking back to a math teacher a decade ago does not justify a fractured skull. The jury will not hear about it. If you attempt to circumvent this ruling, I will hold you in contempt. Are we understood?" Harlan's face flushed a deep, angry red. He leaned in and whispered harshly to his lawyer, "She's protecting him. She's one of them." Voss shot his client a warning look, but it was too late. The acoustics of the courtroom carried the whisper, though the words were slightly muffled. Judge Graves's gaze snapped to the defense table. "Does the defendant have something to share with the court?" Harlan met her eyes, a muscle feathering in his jaw. He was vibrating with indignation. "Just consulting with my attorney, Your Honor," he said, injecting a sarcastic, condescending tilt into his title. Graves stared at him for a long, silent moment. "Maintain courtroom decorum, Mr. Harlan. This is a court of law, not a precinct locker room. Bailiff, bring in the jury." As the jury filed into the box, Harlan's mind raced with bitter, resentful thoughts. He felt the walls of his protected reality beginning to crack. And rather than fear, he felt an overwhelming toxic rage. He was Vance Harlan. He did not answer to people like Loretta Graves. He was determined to prove it. As the trial progressed relentlessly, it evolved from a standard procedural affair into a suffocating crucible for Vance Harlan. A D.A. Nolan Pendleton was methodical, building a wall of evidence, brick by undeniable brick. The prosecution's strategy was clear: dismantle the narrative of the fearful officer and expose the predator underneath. The turning point arrived with the testimony of Harlan's own partner, Officer Ryan Kessler. Kessler was a younger man, only 3 years on the force, and he looked physically ill as he took the oath. He had been beside Harlan on the night of the assault, and under intense pressure from internal affairs, he had broken the blue wall of silence. Pendleton stood near the jury box, his voice calm but probing. "Officer Kessler, let's return to the moment the victim, Quentin Hale, exited his vehicle. Was he holding a weapon?" Kessler swallowed hard, avoiding Harlan's burning glare from the defense table. "No, sir. His hands were empty. He was holding them up near his shoulders." "Did he make any sudden movements toward Officer Harlan?" "No." He asked why he was being pulled over. "And how did Officer Harlan respond?" Kessler looked down at his hands, his voice trembling slightly. "Officer Harlan drew his baton. He told the suspect to shut his mouth. Then he swung." A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. At the defense table, Harlan's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He gripped a ballpoint pen so tightly his knuckles were white, muttering obscenities under his breath. Voss frantically scribbled notes, trying to formulate a damage control cross-examination, but the devastating nature of the testimony was obvious. "Objection!" Voss suddenly shouted, standing up. "The witness is characterizing my client's actions based on subjective hindsight. Officer Harlan was the one closest to the suspect." "Overruled," Judge Graves said instantly, her eyes fixed on Kessler. "The witness is describing what he physically observed. Proceed, Mr. Pendleton." "Officer Kessler," Pendleton continued, walking slowly toward the center of the room. "After Mr. Hale was on the ground, incapacitated, what did Officer Harlan do?" Kessler squeezed his eyes shut. He hit him again and he said something." "What did he say?" "Objection, hearsay, inflammatory," Voss barked, desperation creeping into his tone. "Overruled. The statement was made by the defendant during the commission of the alleged act. The witness will answer," Graves commanded, her posture rigid, projecting absolute authority. He said, "You people need to learn respect. I'll beat it into you if I have to." The courtroom erupted. Gasps echoed from the gallery, and a reporter in the back row dropped his notepad. Judge Graves brought her gavel down twice, sharp and loud. "Order! Order in this court, or I will clear the gallery." The room silenced instantly, terrified by the sheer command in her voice. Harlan was now seething visibly. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. The carefully constructed image of the righteous defender of the peace had been shattered, revealing the ugly, racist truth beneath. He leaned over to Voss, his voice a harsh, venomous hiss. "He's a rat. He's lying to save his own skin, and she's letting him." Voss tried to salvage the situation during cross-examination, attempting to paint Kessler as an inexperienced rookie who panicked and was now being coerced by ambitious prosecutors. But Kessler held firm, his guilt overriding his loyalty to a corrupt partner. As the prosecution rested its case, the defense found itself backed into a perilous corner. Voss requested a brief recess, pulling Harlan into a small holding room adjacent to the courtroom. "Vance, listen to me," Voss pleaded, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The optics are disastrous. The partner's testimony is damning. We need to strongly consider taking the plea deal the DA offered last week. It's 5 years, but we can argue for early parole." "No." Harlan's voice was a low, dangerous growl. He paced the small room like a caged animal. "I am not taking a deal. I am a decorated officer. I will not let that woman in a robe take my life away. Put me on the stand." Voss blanched. "Vance, no. That is the worst thing we can do. Pendleton will tear you apart on cross-examination. You have a temper, and the jury has already heard evidence of racial bias. If you snap up there—" "I said, put me on the stand," Harlan roared, slamming his fist into the cinder-block wall. "I'm going to tell them the truth. I'm going to tell them what it's really like out there, dealing with these animals, while people like her sit in their ivory towers and judge us." Voss closed his eyes, realizing he had lost all control of his client. In the legal world, putting a volatile, deeply prejudiced, and angry defendant on the stand was tantamount to professional suicide. But it was Harlan's constitutional right to testify. When court reconvened, Voss stood, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "The defense calls Officer Vance Harlan to the stand." A low murmur swept through the courtroom. Judge Graves's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. She watched Harlan strut to the witness box. He did not walk like a man fighting for his freedom. He walked like an enforcer patrolling his territory. He took the oath, raising his right hand, his eyes locked on Judge Graves in a brazen display of defiance. He was challenging her in her own domain, driven by a toxic cocktail of arrogance and desperation. Harlan's direct examination by his own attorney was a rigid, rehearsed affair. Voss led him through the standard justifications: high crime area, low lighting, perceived furtive movements. Harlan spoke to the jury with a patronizing tone, painting himself as the thin blue line standing between society and chaos. He claimed Quentin Hale had reached for his waistband, a tired, heavily contested trope that contradicted all physical evidence and his partner's testimony. But the real trial began when Ada Pendleton stood up for cross-examination. Pendleton approached the podium, clutching a tablet. "Officer Harlan, you testified that you believed Mr. Hale was reaching for a weapon." "That's correct," Harlan said, his chin lifted arrogantly. "Yet no weapon was found at the scene, in the vehicle, or on Mr. Hale's person. Sometimes these punks ditch them or we just don't find them." Harlan deflected smoothly. "I see. Let's talk about your body camera, Officer Harlan. You claim it malfunctioned during the physical altercation." "Technology isn't perfect, Counselor. It took a hit during the struggle and shut off." Pendleton offered a thin, grim smile. "Yes. Well, technology can be surprising. For example, the State Forensic Lab was able to recover the final 12 seconds of audio from your camera's internal buffer recorded after the visual feed was cut." Pendleton turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the state moves to introduce Exhibit C, the recovered audio file." Voss jumped up, panicked. "Objection, late discovery, prejudicial." "Your Honor," Pendleton countered calmly, "this audio was recovered just last night by the State Police Cybercrimes Unit. We turned it over to the defense at 8 a.m. this morning." Judge Graves looked at Voss. "Did you receive the file, Mr. Voss?" Voss swallowed. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then it is admissible. The jury has a right to the complete record. Overruled. Play the audio, Mr. Pendleton." Harlan's arrogant facade finally cracked. A flicker of genuine panic crossed his eyes. He had been so certain the camera was dead. The courtroom fell into a deathly silence as Pendleton tapped his tablet. Over the courtroom speakers, a chaotic, muffled sound of scuffling emerged, then the sickening thud of a heavy baton striking flesh. A young man's voice, Quentin Hale, screaming in agony. "Please stop. I didn't do anything." Then Harlan's voice, unmistakable, breathless, and laced with pure, unhinged hatred. "Shut up, boy. You don't talk to me. You people are all the same. Thinking you own the streets, I own you. I'm the law." The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The jury stared at Harlan in horror. 2 jurors, older women, looked physically sick. Pendleton leaned on the podium, staring directly into Harlan's eyes. "Officer Harlan, when you said, 'you people,' who exactly were you referring to?" Harlan was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his suit. His face was a dark, mottled red. The trap had sprung, and the jaws were tight around his leg. The illusion of his righteousness was dead, laid bare before a gallery of strangers. I meant criminals," Harlan stammered, his voice losing its confident edge. "Lawbreakers." "Did you?" Pendleton asked softly. "Because earlier in your career you were reprimanded for using racial slurs against a suspect in custody. Was that also just a misunderstanding of terms?" "Objection!" Voss shouted. "Sustained," Graves ruled smoothly. "The jury will disregard the last question. Mr. Pendleton, restrict your questions to the night in question." But the damage was apocalyptic. Harlan felt the walls closing in. He looked at the jury and saw disgust. He looked at his lawyer and saw defeat. Finally, his eyes snapped up to the bench. Judge Loretta Graves was looking at him. Her expression was not one of triumph or anger or even disgust. It was an expression of profound, chilling indifference. She was looking at him the way one looks at a solved puzzle, a discarded variable. To her, he was no longer a threat, no longer a powerful enforcer. He was simply a man going to prison. That look broke something deep within Vance Harlan. The profound narcissistic injury, the racial animus, the terrifying realization of his impending loss of freedom, it all coalesced into a blinding, white-hot fury. His rational mind shut down, entirely hijacked by adrenaline and a desperate primal need to assert dominance over the woman he blamed for his destruction. "You set me up!" Harlan suddenly roared, his voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. He pointed a trembling, thick finger directly at Pendleton. "You and her. You're trying to ruin a good cop to make a political statement. Mr. Harlan, You will sit down and answer the questions, or I will hold you in contempt, Judge Graves warned, her voice cutting through his shouting, sharp as glass. Don't you tell me what to do, Harlan bellowed, completely unhinged. He turned his rage entirely onto Judge Graves. You sit up there acting like you're better than me. You don't know the streets. You don't know what I do. You're just a... He spat a vicious, vile racial slur that sucked the oxygen out of the room. The courtroom erupted into sheer chaos. The gallery screamed. Voss lunged forward to grab his client. Vance, no. Bailiff, Judge Graves commanded, her voice booming over the din, striking the gavel. Remand the defendant into custody immediately. Bailiff Marcus Telford, a burly veteran court officer, immediately sprinted toward the witness stand, unholstering his handcuffs. Harlan, stand down, hands behind your back. But Harlan was entirely gone. He shoved his own attorney backwards so hard Voss crashed into the defense table, sending papers flying. Telford reached the witness box and grabbed Harlan's arm. Harlan, fueled by rage and his own extensive physical training, spun aggressively, driving his elbow squarely into Telford's jaw. The heavy crack of bone echoed in the room. The bailiff crumpled to the floor, stunned and bleeding. Screams tore through the gallery as people scrambled toward the exit doors. The other court officers were outside in the hallway, seconds away, but too far to stop what was happening right now. Harlan stood in the center of the courtroom, breathing like a bull, his eyes locked onto the one person who hadn't moved, Judge Loretta Graves. She stood behind the bench, her posture perfectly straight, her eyes locked on him with lethal calm. You think you can take my life? Harlan snarled, stepping over the fallen bailiff. The wooden gate separating the well from the bench was the only thing between them. I'll kill you. I swear to God, I'll kill you. With a guttural roar, Harlan charged. He vaulted over the wooden partition with shocking speed for a man his size, his heavy boots crashing onto the carpeted platform leading up to the judge's bench. He reached the mahogany precipice, violently sweeping a computer monitor and heavy law books off the desk as he lunged over the top, his large hands reaching out like meat hooks, aiming directly for Judge Graves's throat. He expected her to shrink back. He expected her to scream. He expected to feel the satisfying terror of a victim yielding to his superior strength. He was catastrophically wrong. Judge Graves did not retreat. She did not cower. As Harlan's massive frame launched over the bench, his arms outstretched, Graves stepped sharply to the side, pivoting on her heel with the flawless, practiced geometry of a martial artist. She did not try to block his incredible momentum. She weaponized it against him. As Harlan flew forward, completely off balance, Graves struck. Her left hand snapped up, locking onto the wrist of his leading arm in an iron grip. Simultaneously, her right hand delivered a brutally precise palm strike directly to the side of his extended elbow joint. The sickening pop of Harlan's elbow, hyperextending, cracked through the air. Harlan's roar of rage instantly morphed into a high, breathless shriek of agony. But Graves was not finished. Using his forward momentum and the agonizing leverage on his hyperextended arm, she smoothly twisted her hips and drove him downward. Harlan's 240-pound frame slammed face first into the solid oak flooring behind the bench with the force of a car crash. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a violent rush. Before he could even comprehend the pain radiating from his broken elbow and shattered nose, a heavy, unyielding pressure slammed into the space between his shoulder blades. Judge Loretta Graves had seamlessly transitioned to the floor, her knee driven flawlessly into his spine, pinning him to the wood with terrifying, immutable force. She pulled his broken right arm high up behind his back, locking it into a severe, subduing hold that threatened to dislocate his shoulder if he twitched. Harlan lay there gasping, blood pooling from his nose onto the floor, utterly paralyzed by pain and shock. The invincible predator of the streets had been dismantled in less than 3 seconds by a 58-year-old woman in a judicial robe. The courtroom doors burst open and 3 armed courthouse deputies flooded the room, weapons drawn. They froze, staring in absolute disbelief at the scene behind the bench. Judge Graves did not look up at the officers. She leaned down, her face mere inches from Harlan's ear. Her voice was not a shout. It was a deadly, icy whisper that chilled him to his marrow. "You are not the law, Mr. Harlan," she said, her voice dripping with absolute authority. "You are merely a criminal, and your time is up." The silence that followed the sickening crunch of Vance Harlan's elbow was absolute, broken only by his high, wet gasps of agony. The 3 courthouse deputies who had breached the doors stood paralyzed for a fraction of a second, their service weapons drawn, unable to process the impossible geometry of the scene. The terror of the precinct, the 240-pound enforcer, was pinned face down behind the mahogany bench by Judge Loretta Graves. "Deputies," Judge Graves said. Her voice was not elevated, but it sliced through the residual shock in the room like a razor. "Secure the prisoner and call for immediate medical assistance for Bailiff Telford." Her command broke the spell. The deputies holstered their weapons and swarmed the bench. Deputy Sergeant Reynolds, a burly man who had known Harlan for years, hesitated for a split second as he looked down at the blood pooling around Harlan's shattered nose. "Carter, you..." Harlan wheezed, spit and blood bubbling past his lips. "You broke my arm. You are under arrest for the attempted murder of a judicial officer, assault on a bailiff, and contempt of court," Graves stated, stepping back seamlessly to allow the deputies to take over. She did not spare Harlan another glance. She smoothed the front of her black robe, entirely unruffled, and immediately walked down the steps to where Bailiff Marcus Telford was sitting up, clutching his bleeding jaw. "Marcus, stay still," she ordered gently, kneeling beside him. Her demeanor shifted instantly from the lethal enforcer to the calm, commanding military captain she had once been. "Suspected mandibular fracture. Don't try to speak. The paramedics are on their way." Behind her, the struggle to handcuff Harlan was brutal. Because of his hyperextended elbow, securing his arms behind his back elicited an ungodly howl of pain that echoed off the high ceilings of courtroom 302. Reynolds and another deputy had to haul him to his feet. Harlan's tailored Navy suit was ruined, smeared with his own blood and the dust from the floor. His face was unrecognizable, swollen, bruised, and contorted in agony and utter disbelief as they dragged him down the center aisle. Harlan looked wildly around the room. The gallery was mostly empty, having fled during the initial charge. But the reporters who had stayed behind were furiously typing on their phones or recording the aftermath. Assistant District Attorney Nolan Pendleton stood by the prosecution table, his tablet still in hand, staring at Harlan with a look of profound disgust. Even Harlan Voss, the defendant's own high-priced defense attorney, was leaning against the wall, rubbing a bruised rib where Harlan had shoved him, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "Harlan!" the prisoner shouted, his voice cracking. "Harlan, do something. She assaulted me. Tell them." Voss did not move. He simply turned his back on his client and began packing his briefcase. The message was clear. You are completely, entirely, on your own. Shortly afterward, Harlan was handcuffed to a steel bed railing in the secure prison ward of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital. His right arm was encased in a heavy plaster cast from wrist to bicep, the joint having required immediate orthopedic reduction. His nose was packed with gauze, forcing him to breathe in shallow, painful rasps through his mouth. The adrenaline had completely faded, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. The walls of the hospital room were painted a sterile, depressing beige, and a uniformed corrections officer sat in a chair by the door, reading a magazine and ignoring him completely. The door opened and Detective Cole Brennan walked in. Brennan was the senior representative for the police union, a man who had pulled Harlan out of the fire on 3 separate occasions over the last decade. Harlan felt a surge of desperate hope. "Cole," Harlan rasped, trying to sit up, but the handcuffs dug viciously into his good wrist. "Cole, thank God. You got to get me out of here. The media is going to spin this. Graves provoked me. She had it out for me from day one." Brennan stopped at the foot of the bed. He did not look angry. He looked exhausted and, far worse, detached. He held a manila folder in his hands, tapping it slowly against the metal footboard. "There is no spin, Vance," Brennan said quietly. "There's no narrative to manage. The courtroom security cameras captured the whole thing. High-definition audio and video. You assaulted your own lawyer. You broke a bailiff's jaw and you tried to strangle a superior court judge in open session." "She broke my arm," Harlan protested, his voice whining in a way he would have despised in anyone else. "Excessive force, Cole. We can sue her. We can countercharge." "Shut up, Vance." Brennan interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. "Just shut up. You don't get it, do you? You aren't a cop anymore. As of moments ago, the commissioner officially terminated your employment. No administrative leave, no internal review. You're done." Harlan stared at him, the words bouncing off his thick skull. "The union held an emergency board meeting while you were in surgery," Brennan continued, opening the folder and dropping a single sheet of paper onto Harlan's lap. "We are officially withdrawing all legal and financial support. Your actions fall entirely outside the scope of your duties. You're a liability, Vance. You're radioactive." "You're abandoning me?" Harlan hissed, his chest heaving. "After everything I've done for the precinct, I held the line. I did the dirty work you cowards didn't want to do." Brennan leaned in, his eyes hard and completely devoid of sympathy. "You didn't do it for us, Vance. You did it because you're a bully who likes hurting people. And today, you picked the wrong person to bully. I'm here as a courtesy to tell you not to call me again. Find a public defender. You're going to need one." Brennan turned and walked out of the room, the heavy metal door clicking shut behind him. For the first time in his life, Vance Harlan was completely, horrifyingly alone. The brass shield he had hidden behind for 15 years was gone, leaving only a broken man handcuffed to a bed. In the days that followed, the city was unrecognizable. The footage of Harlan charging Judge Graves and his subsequent humiliating takedown had leaked to the national press. It was playing on a continuous loop on every major news network. The narrative of the hero cop was dead, replaced by a national conversation about police brutality, systemic racism, and the astonishing composure of Judge Loretta Graves. But the media circus was nothing compared to the legal nightmare that was unfolding behind closed doors. Because Harlan had attacked a sitting judge during a trial regarding civil rights violations, the local jurisdiction was no longer the only dog in the fight. The United States Department of Justice announced it was opening a sweeping federal civil rights investigation into Vance Harlan and the 12th District Precinct. Early one morning, a team of FBI agents led by Special Agent Marcus Kane executed a no-knock federal search warrant on Harlan's suburban home. Harlan, who had been transferred to the county maximum security detention center the night before, was not there to see them batter down his expensive mahogany front door. His wife, however, was. Soon after, she had packed her bags, taken their dog, and driven to her sister's house, leaving a note on the kitchen counter and a voicemail for his newly appointed public defender, stating she was filing for immediate divorce. Special Agent Marcus Kane was a meticulous, unsmiling man who specialized in public corruption. He did not just want Harlan for the assault. He wanted to know how a man like Harlan had operated with impunity for 15 years. Sitting in an interrogation room at the federal building, Kane opened his laptop. Across the metal table sat Harlan, clad in a bright orange county jumpsuit, his right arm in a sling, his face an ugly canvas of yellow and purple bruises. Beside him sat Leland Finch, a vastly overworked public defender who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Mr. Harlan," Kane began, his voice flat, "we have seized your personal electronics, your phone, your home computer, and the tablet in your locker at the precinct." Harlan scoffed, leaning back in his chair, wincing as the movement pulled at his broken elbow. "Knock yourself out. I know my rights. I didn't keep anything illegal on my phone." "No, you didn't," Kane agreed easily. "But you did use a third-party encrypted messaging app called Signal. And unfortunately for you, you failed to enable the auto-delete protocol for a group chat titled Southside Vanguard." Harlan's blood ran cold. The sneer vanished from his face. "We pulled the decryption keys yesterday," Kane continued, turning the laptop around so Harlan could see the screen. It was a massive scrolling document of text messages. There are 4 other officers in this chat, Mr. Harlan. We are executing warrants on them as we speak, but right now I'm interested in your messages from weeks before you nearly beat a young man to death during a traffic stop. Leland Finch leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. Agent Kane, my client hasn't been formally charged federally. He's being charged right now, Mr. Finch, Kane interrupted, handing the lawyer a thick manila envelope. Count 1, deprivation of rights under color of law. Count 2, conspiracy against rights. Count 3, federal witness tampering. Those are in addition to the state charges of attempted murder of a state judge. Kane looked back at Harlan, whose bravado had completely evaporated. He looked physically sick. Let me read this to you, Vance, Kane said, tapping the screen. You sent this message weeks before the incident. That punk kid, Quentin, filed a complaint against Mitchell. Little rat thinks he can touch us. I'm running his plates. Next time he's in the sector, I'm going to teach him a lesson about respect. Finch swore under his breath and rubbed his temples. The state case was bad. This was a death sentence. It proved the assault was not a split-second high-stress reaction. It was a premeditated hit. But it gets worse, Kane said softly. He scrolled down. This is from days before the trial was set to begin with Judge Graves. You wrote, Drew Graves for the trial. The military bitch. If she tries to railroad me to make a point for her people, I swear I'll make her bleed in her own courtroom. The silence in the interrogation room was absolute. Harlan stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open. He had forgotten he wrote that. It was just angry venting after a few beers, tough talk to impress the other guys in the Vanguard chat. But here, printed in sterile black and white, sitting on an FBI agent's desk, it was the final nail in his coffin. It upgraded the assault on Judge Graves to a premeditated retaliatory strike against a federal witness and state official. Under the federal statutes for these specific civil rights violations and premeditated assault on a judicial officer, Kane explained quietly, closing the laptop. You are facing a mandatory minimum of 35 years in federal prison. Because of the RICO implications tied to the Southside Vanguard extortion ring we uncovered in these chats, your pension is immediately revoked. Furthermore, the IRS is currently freezing your bank accounts under civil asset forfeiture laws as we have evidence you were confiscating cash from suspects and keeping it. Karma had not just hit Vance Harlan, it had backed up and run over him a second time. Everything he had built, his reputation, his freedom, his marriage, his financial security, and his terrifying power over the citizens of the South Side, had been systematically dismantled in exactly 72 hours. I want a deal, Harlan whispered, his voice trembling. The hardened enforcer was gone. In his place was a terrified, broken man staring down the barrel of the rest of his life in a concrete box. I can give you the others. I can give you the captain. He knew about the money. Agent Kane stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked down at Harlan with the exact same chilling indifference that Judge Graves had shown him from the bench. We already have the captain, Vance. One of the guys in your little group chat flipped earlier this morning. He gave us everything in exchange for immunity. Kane leaned over the table. The Department of Justice does not need your help. We are not offering a plea bargain. We are going to bury you. As Kane walked out of the room, leaving Harlan sitting in stunned, horrified silence with his public defender, the heavy steel door clicked shut. It sounded exactly like a gavel striking a sounding block. The transition from a position of absolute unchecked authority to becoming a number in the federal penal system is a psychological freefall that few survive intact. For inmate 84912-0-054, formerly Officer Vance Harlan, the descent was a waking nightmare. Housed in the special housing unit of the Metropolitan Correctional Center under 23-hour lockdown for his own protection, Harlan was rotting from the inside out. The cast on his arm was a constant, itchy reminder of his humiliation. The silence of his cell was broken only by the distant, echoing shouts of other inmates, many of whom were men he had personally and often violently put there. Months had passed since the disastrous morning in Courtroom 302. The media frenzy had evolved into a sweeping systemic purge. The United States Department of Justice, specifically the Civil Rights Division, acting under the directives of Assistant Attorney General Serena Blake, had made the 12th District a flagship case for police reform. The federal hammer had shattered the blue wall of silence into a million irreparable pieces. Harlan sat on the edge of his thin, metal-framed bunk, staring blankly at the cinder-block wall. His once imposing physique was softening, the muscle atrophy accelerating due to the confined space and the terrible institutional food. The heavy steel door of his cell clanged open, and a stone-faced corrections officer gestured for him to step out for his weekly legal visit. In the stark, partitioned visiting room, Leland Finch, his public defender, was already waiting. Finch looked no less exhausted than before, but there was a grim finality to his posture today. He slid a thick, bound document across the metal table. "What's this?" Harlan mumbled, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Supplemental discovery," Finch said, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. Agent Kane's team executed another raid last week. They breached a hidden safe in Captain Thorpe's lake house. This is a copy of what they found. Harlan's brow furrowed. Captain Elias Thorpe was the architect of the 12th District, the man who had supposedly protected Harlan, the man Harlan had looked up to as a father figure in the department. Thorpe had been indicted months ago, but Harlan still clung to the delusion that they were brothers in arms, fighting a rigged system. Harlan opened the file with his good hand. It was meticulously organized. There were dates, times, badge numbers, and financial ledgers. But as he read the typed memos, his blood ran to ice. It was a burn file. "Thorpe wasn't protecting you, Vance," Finch said softly, watching the devastation wash over his client's face. "He was insulating himself. Every time you used excessive force, every time you seized cash from a suspect and brought it back to the precinct, Thorpe documented it. He kept a precise ledger of your civil rights violations. If internal affairs or the feds ever got too close, his plan was to hand them this file and claim you were a rogue element, acting entirely without his knowledge." Harlan couldn't breathe. He stared at a memo from years earlier detailing an incident where Harlan had broken a teenager's jaw. At the bottom, in Thorpe's recognizable scrawl, was a note. "Harlan is a useful, blunt instrument, but increasingly unstable. Ready to cut ties and burn him if the heat rises. Retain his insurance." "A useful, blunt instrument," Harlan whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The betrayal was absolute. The narrative he had told himself, that he was a warrior holding the line against the criminal element, respected by his superiors, was a total fiction. He was not a hero. He was not even an alpha dog. He was a disposable attack dog kept on a chain by a man who secretly despised him, waiting for the day he would need to be put down to save his master. The DOJ offered Thorpe a reduced sentence for his cooperation, Finch continued relentlessly. "He took it. He's testifying against you, Vance. He's corroborating the Southside Vanguard texts, the extortion, the premeditation against Judge Graves. He handed them everything." Harlan slammed the file shut, his hands trembling violently. The sheer, unadulterated karma of it all was suffocating. He had built a career on betraying the public trust, and now he had been betrayed by the very corruption he helped sustain. "The trial begins soon," Finch said, gathering his things. "We have no defense. The state and federal prosecutors are moving to consolidate sentencing. Prepare yourself, Vance. You are never going home." Federal Courtroom 4B was entirely different from the state court where Harlan's downfall had begun. It was vast, paneled in dark, imposing walnut, and steeped in an atmosphere of untouchable federal authority. The Honorable Judge Victor Langford, a no-nonsense federal judge with a reputation for maximum sentences in public corruption cases, presided over the gallery. Harlan sat at the defense table. He was no longer wearing a tailored suit. He wore the drab olive-green uniform of a high-risk federal inmate. His wrists and ankles were shackled in heavy chains that clinked sickeningly with his every movement. His arm was out of the cast, but it hung stiffly at his side, the elbow permanently damaged from Judge Graves's devastating counterstrike. He kept his eyes glued to the defense table, unable to look at the packed gallery behind him. The trial had been a slaughter. Without Thorpe's protection, without the Union, and with his own recorded words echoing in the courtroom, the jury had returned guilty verdicts on all 22 federal and state counts in a matter of hours. Today was sentencing. "Does the state have any victim impact statements?" Judge Langford asked, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "We do, Your Honor," the federal prosecutor replied. "We call Quentin Hale." Harlan flinched. Quentin, the young college student he had beaten nearly to death, walked slowly to the podium. He still walked with a slight limp, and the faint scar from the orbital fracture was visible under the harsh courtroom lights. But Quentin stood tall, radiating a quiet, profound dignity that Harlan had never possessed. "Your Honor," Quentin began, his voice steady. "For a long time I had nightmares about the man sitting at that table. I thought he was a monster. I thought he was unstoppable. He told me he owned the streets and that he was the law." Quentin looked directly at Harlan. Harlan couldn't meet his gaze. "But sitting here today, I see he's just a bully who hid behind a badge. He took my sense of safety, but he didn't take my future. I graduate with my engineering degree soon. He, however, has nothing left." Quentin stepped down and the heavy silence returned to the room. "The court also recognizes the Honorable Judge Loretta Graves," Judge Langford announced, a note of deep professional respect entering his voice. The air in the courtroom seemed to shift as Judge Graves stood up from the front row of the gallery and approached the podium. She did not wear her judicial robes today. She wore a sharp charcoal gray business suit. She looked exactly as she had the day Harlan attacked her. Immaculate, composed, and terrifyingly calm. She adjusted the microphone. "Your Honor," she began, her clear, resonant voice carrying effortlessly. "When Vance Harlan launched himself over my bench, he did not just attack an individual. He attacked the institution of justice. He operated under the delusion that violence and intimidation could override the rule of law. He believed that his prejudice was a shield and his badge was a weapon." Harlan closed his eyes. The sound of her voice made his damaged elbow ache with phantom pain. "I did not request this time to express fear or anger, because I feel neither toward Mr. Harlan." Graves continued smoothly, delivering the ultimate psychological blow. "I feel only pity. He is a relic of an ugly, archaic mindset that has no place in our society or our justice system. The law is not a weapon to subjugate the vulnerable. It is a shield to protect them. When the defendant forgot that, he ceased to be an officer of the law and became merely a violent statistic." She looked at Judge Langford. "I ask the court to impose a sentence that reflects the severity of his betrayal to the badge he wore and the citizens he was sworn to protect." "Thank you." She walked back to her seat, her heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor. Judge Langford leaned forward, looking down at Harlan. "Mr. Harlan, stand up." Finch helped Harlan to his feet. The chains around his ankles rattled loudly in the dead, silent room. "Vance Harlan," Langford said, his voice hard as iron. "You have disgraced the uniform. You operated a criminal enterprise under the guise of public safety. You brutalized innocent citizens and, when faced with accountability, you attempted to murder a sitting judge in open court. You are a predator, and society must be permanently protected from you." Langford adjusted his reading glasses. "On the federal counts of deprivation of rights, conspiracy, and witness tampering, I sentence you to 35 years in federal prison. On the state counts of attempted murder of a judicial officer and aggravated assault, I sentence you to 25 years. These sentences are to run consecutively without the possibility of parole. 60 years. It was a death sentence. You are remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals to be transferred to the United States Penitentiary at Florence, Colorado. Court is adjourned." The crack of the gavel sounded exactly like a gunshot. As the marshals grabbed Harlan by his shackled arms to lead him away, he looked back one last time. He saw Captain Thorpe being led through a side door by his own handlers. He saw his ex-wife's empty seat in the gallery. And finally, he saw Judge Loretta Graves. She was not smiling. She was not gloating. She simply watched him go, her eyes reflecting the cold, hard reality of the law he had thought he could break. As the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut behind him, plunging him into the dim, concrete hallway that would be his reality for the rest of his life, Vance Harlan finally understood the true weight of karma. The fall of Vance Harlan serves as a stark, dramatic testament to the immutable principle that true power lies not in violence, but in the unwavering application of the law. He built his life on a foundation of prejudice and brute force, hiding his cowardice behind a badge he fundamentally dishonored. The absolute karma of his demise, dismantled physically by the very woman he sought to humiliate and legally by the corrupt allies he trusted, strips away the myth of the untouchable rogue cop. Judge Graves's composed, lethal defense of her courtroom became the catalyst that shattered a systemic ring of abuse, restoring a measure of peace to the South Side. Ultimately, Harlan's story is a profound reminder that the arc of the moral universe is long, but when it finally bends toward justice, it strikes with devastating, unyielding precision.